joining. I am Liz Hobson, Museum Administrator at the Idaho State Museum. I'm stepping in for Allison Espandola for this very special History Happy Hour. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. The Idaho State Historical Society, including the Idaho State Museum, Idaho State Archives, State Historic Preservation Office, and the Old Idaho Penitentiary and Historic Sites, are dedicated to preserving and promoting Idaho history through programming like tonight and on-site visits. We offer dynamic and engaging programs that serve Idahoans across the state and have done so for the last 140 years, and we look forward to many more years to come. We also want to thank all the Idaho State Historical Society members who may be joining us tonight. Thank you for supporting the work we are able to do for Idaho. And for more information about how you can become a member and join us in our next 140 years, please visit our website at history.idaho.gov. Tonight, to get us started, actually, put in the chat if you would like what you all are drinking tonight for History Happy Hour. I'm just going with water tonight, but please feel free to share in the chat what you all are drinking. And tonight, we are diving into the world of museum collections and talking about the 140 years of collecting and stewarding artifacts that tell the story of Idaho. To celebrate our 140 years of collecting, we are also opening a pop-up exhibit in our Canyon Gallery here at the Idaho State Museum on September 3rd that will highlight some of the artifacts we are talking about tonight and how collecting has changed throughout the decades. As a reminder, please feel free to put your questions in the chat section. I will try my hardest to get to as many questions as possible answered in our time together tonight. So let's get right to it. We are joined tonight by our Curator of Collections and Exhibitions here at the Idaho State Museum, Sarah Phillips. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm excited to talk about museum collections.
Great. So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I have been with the Idaho State Historical Society for over 13 years now. I have been deep into museum collections that entire time. So I've really had the privilege of taking care of the collections for the state of Idaho and getting a good look at all of the hidden treasures that we've got. I have a master's degree from Boise State University in applied historical research, and I did graduate work at the George Washington University in museum collections management and care. So being able to work hands-on with the collection and see how those fit into different exhibits has really been kind of the pinnacle of my career.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing everything with us. So let's start at the beginning, if we can. How did the Idaho State Historical Society start collecting?
So we originally started collecting as the Idaho Pioneers. So it was a group of really passionate individuals who had come very early to the state. It was primarily centered in the Treasure Valley. So there was a group of people there, but the interest for collecting Idaho's history really spread throughout the state and gained a lot of interest over time. They started collecting kind of informally for a while, and then we were turned into a state agency, which we still are today. So the collection goes back a long, long ways. So our very first artifact, if you're interested in knowing about that,
yes,
we can
please.
dive in. So our first artifacts really kind of speak to the population of the Treasure Valley at the time. The very first artifact that we ever accepted into the permanent collection is an ox shoe. So you can see it here. This is not necessarily the oldest piece in our collection, but it's the first piece in our collection. We always keep track of who it was that actually donated the piece to us. And you can kind of get a sense of what it was that those early Idaho pioneers thought was going to be relevant history. They wanted to tell their story. So, and, looking at the next artifact, maybe. So this is our second. So the ox shoe was the very first collection piece. This little wooden box is actually the second artifact that we accepted into the permanent collection. This is a little wooden box. It's only about 3 inches tall, and it's got wood inlay. It was actually a gift to the Historical Society from C.K. Afong. So I'm sure people recognize that name. He owned an apothecary in Boise and was a really, really important member, not just of the Chinese community in Boise, but the community at large. He served a really broad reach of people with medical treatments and, you know, really supporting the community. So it's exciting to me to have something from him as the second piece in our collection.
Oh, wow. So knowing I see all of the numbers there and I see the description. So how do you keep track of all of these records, of all of these items?
Yeah, early on, we actually used what people can see here. We started numbering things sequentially. So the ox shoe is number 1. When you look at the accession records, you can see the descriptions of things. So the early people collecting wrote down what was important to them and said number 1 is an ox shoe worn by one of the teams of oxen driven by the donor's people crossing the plains in 1863. So we can really kind of attach the story, or what we call the provenance of an artifact, back to the original piece. And these records are really what tie those two things inherently together. So we number every artifact that comes in. We can't do it sequentially anymore because we just have too many things. But we still maintain these records in a very similar way, just in a digital format now, to keep track of when we got something and who donated it and why we think it's important.
Wow. So in this time, so going back to the first item that we as a historical society collected all the way up to the present, in your thoughts, how have you seen collecting initiatives and really collecting practices change over the years? And how is that reflected in the state's collection that we have today?
What I think is really interesting about museum collections, and you know, our collection here at the State Museum really reflects this very well, I think. Originally, we started out kind of as a cabinet of curiosities. So we would take in anything that seemed interesting. That could be ox shoes, but that could also be dead spiders. You know, if somebody thought that something they found was going to be of scientific interest in the future, they would donate those things to us. Over time, we've really honed in what we want to do. So in our mission, we look for things that preserve Idaho's cultural heritage. And so that's really what we look for now. Pieces like the stained glass dome that you see here, it's one of the most popular pieces, I think, in the museum right now because it's just so striking and beautiful. It originally came to us in 1977 when the Owaihi Plaza Hotel was officially closing down and kind of going over some major renovations. So residents of Boise probably know the Owaihi Plaza Hotel now is the Owaihi. You can go have amazing dinner and all kinds of stuff there. It's no longer the hotel it was before, but we still have worked to really preserve the spirit of it. I wanted to show this picture because nobody ever gets to see this part of the dome. What people usually see is the underside when you go into the Idaho room here at the Idaho State Museum. But the inner portion is up in the ceiling and there's a catwalk. And so this kind of gives you a sense of the construction of the dome itself and how each of the pieces got carefully laid in before we were open to the public, and how we braced it to make sure that it stays safe well into the future.
And you have a personal connection with the dome. I know that you spent many years. Can you talk a little bit about that now that we have the dome put up here and just talk about what goes into caring for some of these collection pieces as well.
Yeah. So the dome was obviously originally at the Owaihi Plaza Hotel. When they removed it from the Owaihi Plaza, it came here to the museum, and longtime fans of the museum probably remember it being in the museum prior to our 2018 renovation. So it has found a place for people to enjoy for a very long time. But when we closed the museum down and de-installed this dome, as we were getting ready for the renovations, we got up close and personal and saw that it really needed some TLC. It had well over 100 years of dirt and grime and all kinds of stuff. So I was able to clean it all lovingly with, dental tools, and under the supervision of a glass conservator, we were really able to kind of bring it back to life. And it now shines a more like rich golden color versus a darker amber. And that was because there was an old resin that went over it to protect it, and we were able to clean all of that off.
So each item in the collection is really unique, takes different conservation techniques, but also you just showed us a whole bunch of different sizes too. So we had something as small as you said, a small little box, to the very large dome that now is in the museum. So what are the most kind of bizarre or the weird items? You mentioned spiders, which would also be considered that, but what other items might there be out there in the collection?
So we have a lot of strange things that I think are weird and wonderful. So probably my favorite piece, I've got a video of it. So this is an animatronic doll. Although it was donated in the 1970s, it was actually used in the 20s and in the 30s after prohibition had already been repealed. The Women's Christian Temperance Union in Idaho used this guy as advertising, basically. One of the things that I think is really interesting about him is that he still is fully functional. So you can see him ringing his bell. He's telling you the story of why alcohol is bad. And what I think is weird and wonderful, other people might not agree with. So I am very curious to know what participants might think of him. So if people want to like add in the chat box, what do you feel about our little prohibition guy?
I'm also really impressed that it's still functional and that you can hear the bell, and it's something to see. So yeah, for our participants, what do you all think of? Yes, we got the eyebrows. That's definitely part of it. It says that there's a lot to this artifact.
There is. And going back to those records that we keep to kind of tie the artifact to its provenance, we know now that this gentleman's name is Dr. Wise. So he was the wise doctor telling everybody the evils of liquor. I see, how do the pages turn? There's actually a motor inside and a number of spokes. And so it turns each page. It's really pretty fascinating to look at. The donor's original intent was to share the joy that this piece brought to so many people. It was described as a very happy artifact. I don't know if people would consider it a happy artifact anymore. There's too many Annabelle movies, I think. So I think he's wonderful, but he's also very strange, and I love him. So.
Well, thank you for sharing. And as a reminder to our audience tonight, put any questions that you may have for Sarah in the chat bar. And before we continue our conversation about collecting, I have another question for you all joining us. Please keep telling us what you think of the the doll here, but also what other topics would you be interested in learning about through a history happy hour or other programming here at the museum and the Historical Society? So feel free to throw that in the chat as well as we move on. Talking about, so we've talked about the weird and the bizarre out there, and the big and the small, but looking to the future and how do we collect in real time as well, and how do you see, what items are you looking to add for the collection in the future?
I think one of the things, we talked about kind of that feeling of a cabinet of curiosity in the past. Now we collect with a lot more thought and insight into what's actually happening today that people 100 years from now are going to want to know more about. So one of our most recent acquisitions is the COVID-19 Memorial installation. This was at a Boise home for most of the last year. The woman who created this installation donated all of the flags and the signage that she made. And so what we're moving towards is really having an understanding of what historical moments in time are occurring as they occur, and to really be mindful of how we're documenting those. So now, because we have this collection of things, we have a 3D printed respirator in our collection, some masks. We're hoping to have some other collections that really kind of bolster that story. In 100 years, people will be able to get a more comprehensive look of how culture in Idaho was impacted by COVID-19. So we're doing future Idahoans a huge service, I think, by really seeking out things in a thoughtful way and creating a story out of these artifacts now instead of wishing that we had them down the road.
Definitely, and I believe we do have some of those items on display currently in our Canyon Gallery. Our GEM intern students did an exhibit on COVID-19, so you can come see those items. But also, speaking of the future, can you tell us a little bit about the exhibit that's coming up?
Yeah, so our next exhibit is called Collecting Idaho. So we're showcasing the history of Idaho Historical Society's collections here in the museum in the Canyon Gallery. What we're really looking at is kind of celebrating collecting for 140 years. There's going to be one artifact from every decade that is included in there to kind of represent not just where our thoughts were when we were collecting, but things that represent these major events that happened that kind of defined a decade. One example, obviously, is COVID-19, but then we go back to the 60s and we've got some protest pins, civil air defense, that kind of thing. So we want to make sure that people are able to see some of those collection pieces that we don't get to take out all the time, and also kind of share our story as a historical agency and why it's important that we collect what we do.
Definitely, and that's a big task to pick one item that represents an entire decade. So that's a big task ahead. So that will be really interesting to see. Coming up September 3rd, I believe, right?
Yep, opening September 3rd. You know, with one thing kind of representing each decade, I think there's an opportunity to have a lot of fun with it. So people can come and see what artifact kind of represents the decade that they were born in. And I don't mind aging myself. I was born in the 80s. And so I personally would love to see like a Madonna album and, you know, maybe some like lace gloves or something, but people will have to come check out what we have and see what represents them.
Definitely. So we can take some audience questions now, if you don't mind. We have one, so we've talked about all of the different types of artifacts, but how many items do we have in the state's collection?
So in the museum collection, which is pretty sizable, it's over 50,000 different objects. That does not include archival material. So our state archives stewards thousands and thousands of different paper-based documents. But what we take care of here at the museum is about 50,000 different material objects. And it's everything from, little wooden boxes all the way to over 12,000 different textiles in our collection. We've got dozens of saddles representing the horse culture and ranching culture in Idaho. So we kind of look for things that celebrate all different aspects of what it means to live here.
And do you have a favorite item?
So I think my favorite item is probably the dome, just because I was able to work on it so closely. And I think there's something magical in when you're a history nerd like I am, to bring something back to life in a way that is meaningful and makes it available for more people to see and fall in love with. There's a couple pieces though that I think are just hugely impactful to us as a state. And fortunately, we get to see those pretty often. The state seal painted by Emma Edwards Green, which is also on exhibit right now in Trailblazing Women of Idaho, I think is a really beautiful representation of, how she saw the state. And it's kind of that shining star now still in our state's collection, and being the only state seal that we know of that's been designed by a woman is pretty spectacular.
Absolutely. So for the upcoming exhibit, or any exhibit, is it just you as curator who selects those artifacts, and how do you narrow it down to what is shown?
So it's definitely not just myself. There's always a team of people that works on any sort of exhibition that we're developing. What we typically look for when we're deciding what collections pieces to include in an exhibit is how something can tell a story. I want to make sure that when visitors come to the museum, they're seeing things that tell more than just kind of text on a panel, something that really carries a story forward or adds to it. One of the examples that I really like to give is we do a fantastic job telling the story of the history of mining in Idaho in our permanent galleries upstairs. And the artifacts that are on exhibit do the huge service of actually talking about what it was like to be a Chinese miner in the early mining days in Idaho. So those artifacts speak for themselves. We look for things that kind of add to that storyline and can enhance people's understanding and inspiration for something. And we always look for that kind of thing to include in exhibits to make it more powerful.
Absolutely. Another question, I have some things left to me from my grandparents when they passed. A collection of old photographs, clothing, books, and furniture. How can I donate these to the Idaho State Museum?
So we would love to see anything that anyone has that they would be willing to donate to us. One of the things that we look at as a larger state agency is what would be more appropriate for our archives to steward and what would be appropriate for the museum. So when you have a mixed collection like that, you get to talk to representatives of both of those places, and we would check out what you have and see how it tells the story of what it was like to be in Idaho. Then here at the museum, we take those things to what we call a collections committee. So it's a group of people who are really well versed in the agency's mission and vision, but also understand the collection and where we're going in the future with it. and decide if it would be appropriate for the permanent collection. And, sometimes they're not. And if they're not appropriate for our collection, we always look at other museums, our colleagues all around the state, and see where might be a good home.
Wonderful. And I think we will, when we end, we will put the link to how to get in touch with you and our collections page at the very end of this. Well, with that number of how many items you have in the collection, how do you care for the objects? What are the things that you have to consider when doing that?
One of the biggest things that we look for is just kind of that proactive step of how are things being stored long term. So with 50,000 artifacts that we steward, we want to make sure that as we are getting things into the collection, we look at things from an archival perspective and a preservation perspective. Clean and tidy anything up. People might be surprised at how those everyday things that might get on something can start to deteriorate an artifact long term. So we think about all of those things. We look at environmental conditions and how we can kind of make sure that we're storing things in the best environment for them. And then it gets even as far as, what is the material that it's made out of, and how do we best take care of a certain material at the museum. I think it would be a fantastic band name, but there's this factor called inherent vice in the museum collections world. And inherent vice is the idea that the material that something is made out of is basically going to deteriorate within itself. And a great example of that is like vinyls and plastics. They're chemically unstable. So the best way we can go about preserving those is to keep them cool. And we actually have, deep freezes that we store artifacts in to kind of ensure that they're staying preserved and not deteriorating as rapidly as they would otherwise. So collections, tips and hints,
Yeah, thank you. As we get ready to wrap up our conversation tonight, for you personally, what does it mean to you that you're part of stewarding a collection that has grown for 140 years and continues to grow?
I think for me, it's just a very meaningful experience. You think about as an individual what those amazing treasures are that you would never want to give up. Maybe it's your grandmother's china or your mother's wedding dress. It could be, the first piece of jewelry you ever got or your favorite book. And all of those things have an emotional connection and kind of a hidden history that people don't know about unless you tell them that story. So for me, it's just a privilege to be the person who gets to take care of those treasures. All the items in our collections were part of somebody's life. There's a story that usually we know, but you have to think about going back to the ox shoe. Who was the family being brought across the plains by the ox wearing that shoe? And who are the people that, physically touched those things and kind of left their story in a way that is just left for us to discover. And so to be able to take care of those things that, are just waiting for discovery is kind of a dream come true.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for joining tonight. And thank you for sharing so much about the Idaho State Historical Society collections and all you do to steward them. The Idaho State Museum is committed to providing opportunities like this to share with you, our visitor, while at home or at one of our sites. We will send out a survey to figure out what you thought of tonight's program and for up-to-date information about our other events, such as our next History Happy Hour or how to become a member or to sign up for our newsletter, please visit our website at history.idaho.gov. or stay up to date on all of our social media pages. We hope to see you at one of our sites soon and have a great night.